Deal or no deal? Don't be silly. We're just one day closer to the cliff, no closer to an agreement. Everybody seemingly is twiddling their thumbs, or is that just for the camera's sake? We're going to fill you in on what is and isn't going on in our nation's capital. And next, the Supreme Court will take up same-sex marriage. Could we soon see same-sex marriages from coast to coast in America, or could it go the other way? We'll get into that and more potential changes here on major social issues. And later, what is Hillary's next move? One of the most respected figures in the country, but how did she go from being so intensely disliked from some here to now venerated Secretary of State? We're going to go over what a strange trip it's been. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thanks so much for joining us this Friday evening, December 7th. And we got some news that we brought to you right before the show, and if you're catching us late, I'll catch up to speed here. President Obama, he will be asking Congress for $60.4 billion in federal aid for New York, New Jersey, and pretty much Connecticut, states hit very hard, as we all know, by Superstorm Sandy. Governor Cuomo just holding a press conference where he praised the news here, and he said there'll be a lot of flexibility attached. Obviously, the House and the Senate have to go along, but for whatever it's worth, it got bipartisan support from the New York delegation and I believe also New Jersey delegation, so fingers crossed. We'll see how that goes. All right, let's get to other news now. Another day in D.C. has come and gone with no deal or even seemingly tangible progress when it comes to the fiscal cliff. And now, just 25 days away from the edge of that cliff slope, whatever you want to call it. Not only has there not been a deal today, but there's been nothing really frankly positive to report, at least from what we've seen for public consumption. But are we closer to compromise, or to one party simply opposing its will on the other in a game of leverage? Now, to help us find some of those answers, let's bring in our panel tonight. Gian-Carlo, former advisor to both Presidents Bush, Jr. and Sr. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, but so much more. Ryan Davis, Executive Director of Social Innovation at Blue State Digital and Media Strategy, a good firm. And also Andrew Whitman, our Senior Political Correspondent. Okay. Guys, let's get into what is and isn't happening here, and we can really break this into three different categories. Let's first start off with leverage here. It seems pretty clear to me the president doesn't only seem to think he has it, but he's playing this, Gian-Carlo, that he does. And we'll start with the revenue standpoint. We saw the two different plans are floated. Nobody took either one really seriously, but at the end of the day, the longer, at least from my perspective, it goes where Republicans say we're going to fight here to not extend the middle-class tax cut unless we get the top two guaranteed to freeze at 35% right now, is a day they lose in the news cycle. And the polls certainly seem to suggest the public's with the president on this one.
Well, I think that's right. And I think one of the fatal flaws in the strategy that the Republicans, led, of course, by Speaker Boehner, took was allowing this debate to be one about rates. I think a much smarter tactic would have been to agree to a sum of revenue that needed to be raised, and for the Republicans to find ways to get to that number and make the issue about how we got to that number, not about whether or not we're going to increase rates on which socioeconomic group is going to have their taxes raised or not. That's a loser for the party.
Can you explain to me why, though? I heard a great shot from Bill Gristol, who said, what are we doing here as a party? We're fighting for, frankly, a portion of the electorate, the wealthiest, that break Democrat at least 50-50, if not more. Why are we fighting, his words here, right, for the media elites, the Hollywood types here, the guys who didn't give us money to begin with here? The public holds it against us, and it's not like, you know, we got to protect this constituency. They break more left than right.
Well, I think there's a political reason and there's an actual reason. The political reason is if you're the standard bearer of a party, as John Boehner is at this point, and you give or you cave or you concede on taxes, then for run-of-the-mill Republicans, myself included, you say, well, why am I a Republican if I can't even count on the leader of my party to hold the line on taxes?
Why I think, Gian-Carlo. If he comes out and says, Boehner or whoever, right, listen, we want to freeze rates on the 98, but they've said it pretty much. Right. And we will go against a lot of what we stand for, because for love of country, we're going to agree to increase. We would like to see it begin at 500 grand, not 250. We'd like the cap to be whatever the number, 37, 38%. Over to you, Mr. President. Right. Where do you concede? Now they push the narrative back to the president to have to make some concessions. Until they do that, the president can wait, and he's going to be able, we'll get into a couple other things, to hold out for what he really wants here, which isn't just a tax hike.
But there's two outcomes there, right? The first outcome is You don't want to raise taxes because you truly believe it will harm the economy. I truly believe it will harm the economy, especially the small businesses. We all know, we've learned through this debate, very much begin at that $250,000 level. Now, the flip side of that is if they can extract a real compromise on entitlements, real fundamental reform on things like Medicare, then I think the Republicans can save face. They can go back to their party and say, look what we've done.
Gian-Carlo, and teach you a word you probably already know from old TV you've done, segue. You just gave me a good one. Ryan, let me ask you, on the entitlement thing, I know I've heard from Durbin, I've heard from other members in the left part of the Democratic Party say they're off the table. We're not talking Medicare, we're not talking Social Security. I believe down deep that the president would like nothing more, maybe they're working this out with Boehner, and say, listen, you give me what I need on the rate side. I'll act like you drag me kicking and screaming, but I want to reform Medicare because I need to have revenue savings here on the cut sides, that I have to make some cuts. Down deep, is he even worried about the left wing of the party, or is he happy to concede on this and maybe even making some long-term structural changes to Social Security, even though that's not really in this pot?
Yeah, no, I think that the president believes there needs to be some kind of entitlement reform, but who knows how much cost savings that'll be. It'll have to be entitlement reform with some tax money brought in. I mean, there are also common sense things you can do with Social Security, like means testing. I mean, clearly that would make that.
And
would
Republicans
save us money.
didn't support that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are things we can do to fix entitlements and to regulate.
And do you think the president down deep wants that?
I think down deep the president wants to come to not have to do this every year, to actually have something here that he can sign that will actually solve this problem for now.
And Dom, you really think the president cares what the left wing of the party says, hey, we got leverage here? You know, the argument of kind of like, we won, they lost, give them nothing. I think, forget trying to sound like a good guy, he wants to be able to make some concessions here so he can have a bigger chunk and he can say, I made some tangible thing, not some cosmetic thing where I believe the top end should pay more here, but it's a drop in the bucket. He's got to get some real savings coming from defense, from Medicare, some real tangible places.
Well, first of all, Richard, that my way or the highway approach doesn't work when you're the president of the United States, no matter what party you're of. The president has to govern. And if he demands and insists on totally receiving everything he asks for, guess what's going to happen when it comes to issues down the road? He's going to face a major problem.
Immigration, energy,
that's
education.
Right. The issue right now, I think the next biggest problem, the Republicans couldn't just concede automatically on taxes. How do you go for tax increases? How do you go from fighting tax increases and a pledge of no tax increase and then overnight just go, okay, we'll raise taxes? So they had to stand firm on that. It's a credit to the Republican leadership that it appears that they're willing to give. The next fight on whether we're going to see this deadline, I have a funny feeling they're going to demand the same amount of cuts to entitlements that there are for a tax increase. And I don't know if the left wing of the Democratic Party will go along with that.
And Andrew, for me, I think the president cares as much about this next item as the two that we've mentioned, whether it be entitlements or tax hikes. The debt limit here. I know this is inside baseball and white noise to some people, but at the end of the day, this handcuffs the president from people closer to him as much as anything, and it drives him nuts how it grinds Washington to a halt. Republicans like the leverage that this debt limit gives them on fiscal policy, but the White House, they want this debt limit to go away at least for the next 4 years, and they're seeking either a long-term or a permanent end to this limit and debt limit votes. And the Republican Party, they're not exactly doing cartwheels over the concept. Take a listen.
By demanding the power to raise the debt limit whenever he wants, by as much as he wants, he showed what he's really after is assuming unprecedented power to spend taxpayer dollars without any limit at all. Well, I assure you it's not going to happen. The American people want Washington to get spending under control, and the debt limit is the best tool we have to make the president take that demand seriously.
First, the pro forma thing. Historically, we've basically rubber stamped this thing until recently, right?
Yeah, have you ever heard of a president having to deal with a debt limit negotiation that it looked like it might not actually happen other than President Obama? The answer is no, because it's never happened. President Obama is the first president to actually have the cudgel of we won't increase the debt limit hanging over his head, and it led to a downgrade the last time.
I agree. We've talked about this morning that it is an inefficient way to run a government to keep having this conversation. That said, of all the arguments the president wants right now, this is the toughest one he can put on a bumper sticker, because it philosophically sounds right to say, hey, wait a second, why do I want to give a blank check here to keep raising the debt? on my credit card at home, I got a limit. I can't keep spending over my limit here. And why should I have the federal government who spends like a drunken sailor? Why should I give them more power?
I actually think it's the easiest of the three to put on a soundbite because you're talking about revenue versus rates when you're talking about taxes, and when you're talking about Medicare means testing. I'm not sure if people are going to be able to differ.
Here's the thing. They want to stick it to the top 2%. They want them to pay their fair share. That's
right,
the tax
but the
hike
counter
that people
argument
get.
is with revenue, and that's a little harder to understand. When you're talking about entitlements and means testing, I don't know if a lot of people get what means testing is, or if they just think he's looking to cut my Medicare.
Say, stop doing basically this stand down every time about trying to increase the debt limit? Why would most Americans buy into it?
Because we saw it last year, and we saw how this played out, and we saw the impact of them just fiddling around without even getting a deal.
I think Americans want America to pay their bills, and so if it's between raising this debt limit or not paying the bills, raising the debt limit to win
But
every
there's
time.
also, the other factor here is it has the most immediate consequence of all of these things. If we don't do this, we saw, to Andrew's point, what happens, and that is Wall Street comes and the rest of the world comes and beats our country about the face and neck, saying if you can't get it straight about how to pay your bills, there are going to be real, tangible, embarrassing consequences like lowering your debt rating.
Last year, right at this time, Wall Street guys were saying, what the heck are you doing? Right. You're going to downgrade our credit rating, full faith in credit, you can't default on your bills. And we saw what happened. We went over. Why would the Republican Party change their tune if everything I've heard from McConnell and others say, this is my best chip I'm going to play? You think I'm going to give up the debt limit?
Because this is the most clear, blamable thing to the Republicans. Obama can hammer Republicans with this, and he did last year.
He did, but do you think they changed their tune?
I think at the end of the day, the debt limit debate is also it's a proxy for federal spending. That's what that's really what we're debating here. It has nothing to do with the debt limit.
It's an artificial.
Fair enough, but it becomes, for the party faithful, it becomes a proxy fight over a bigger issue, which is this country going to continue on an unsustainable path of spending money we don't have?
When in reality, you said you were going to pay this, and now you're not going to pay this. That's what the debt limit is. Can I make this a more
simple thing about just the branding and the messaging? Don't the Republicans really want the next month and a half to just go away so that they can get back to rebuilding their party? And I ask that by saying, even if they give in on stuff that philosophically, was like a bright red line, we don't raise taxes. Even if they give in and say, fine, we'll raise the rates. If they couch it as a way to say, listen, we philosophically disagree with a lot of this. But right now, America is where it is. We're going to make this sacrifice, and the president's going to make spending cuts as well here. We are a party here who is trying to find the middle, and then find the next fight to go over. They can't win this fight.
I'm not sure I agree with that, and here's why. Because if you look at the so-called grand bargain, when you're putting everything on the table, you're talking about entitlement reform, and you're talking about tax reform in the aggregate. My gosh, if you're a Republican in Congress, that's raw meat for you. That's why you were elected, because you wanted to tackle these things.
But did November change anything?
Well, of course it changed things, but it didn't change the desire to fix those two huge elements of the federal government that many of the Republican faithful think are the things we need to do more than anything else. If we don't get those right, nothing else matters.
Even if they believe Gian-Carlo, at the end of the day, the polls and the election will say they're going to be the ones that are going to pay the price.
Well, I think it depends on what the deal is and how it's worked out.
That's the other thing they're doing. They're looking for a chink in President Obama's armor after the election. They're looking for a weakness that they can attack and exploit.
I tell you, the best thing they do is they give in on the top end rates and say, now show me the cuts. If they do that, they put, for the first time since the election, the president on defense. Until they do that, the president can say, hey, I'm fighting for you. They're fighting for the rich guys. Fair or not, that's a simple thing on a bumper sticker.
There's 2 points there. Number one, they have to be able to quantify the entitlement reform and the savings. They have to be able to go back to the country and say, yes, maybe we raised your taxes, some of you, but here's what we saved the country in the aggregate in terms of entitlement reform. And the second point is, they don't have history on their side. George H.W. Bush went through this exact same process. The whole read my lips, and what did we get? We got increased taxes and questionable reforms, and it blew up in his face, unfortunately. And there's long memories in Washington.
But it helped the country.
It did.
We take a quick break. When we come back, it is about the social issues. The High Court, they will take up same-sex marriage. Separately, it's now completely legal here to light up in Washington state here. We're going to possibly see soon not just same-sex marriage, but also the argument, I believe, is inevitabilities in this country. The legalization of same-sex marriage coast to coast, and then the possibility in our lifetimes of legalized marijuana. We'll talk about both those things after this.